There's something scary on the moon. I worked at NASA for decades, but even now, years into retirement, one specific question still haunts me. Why did we abandon the moon? Officially, the end of the Apollo program was attributed to budget cuts and waning public interest, but for those of us who were there, that explanation never felt right. In the early 1970s, Apollo was the pride of the agency. Every mission was a spectacle broadcast to millions around the world. The science we produced was groundbreaking, and the possibilities seemed endless. Yet, in December 1972, with Apollo 17, it all came to an end. At the time, I was part of the systems team, involved in planning technologies for future lunar missions. We had projects lined up for permanent bases on the lunar surface, long-term studies of the moon's geology, and even missions to Mars on the horizon. Then suddenly everything was shelved. The dream dissolved into silence. When the decision was announced, the atmosphere at the agency changed. I vividly remember one specific meeting where the implications of the cancellation were discussed. Someone asked what would happen to the dozens of ongoing projects. One of the directors replied with a coldness that unsettles me to this day. "Some things are better left unresolved." Those words echoed through the room. Everyone fell silent, but no one questioned it. That was how things worked at NASA back then. Questioning high-level decisions was, at best, futile and, at worst, career suicide. It wasn't until years later that I began to suspect there was more behind that decision. As part of my work, I had access to classified files, mission reports, and records that were never made public. In the months following the end of the Apollo program, I was tasked with reviewing and organizing some of these documents for permanent archiving. That's when I came across a series of reports that didn't make sense. Reports from Apollo 11, 12, and 14 detailed communication failures, unexplained interference that, at the time, had been attributed to technical issues. However, handwritten marginal notes by technicians suggested that the signals came from external sources, something that was never disclosed. The strangest thing, however, was an internal memo dated August 1971, before Apollo 15. It was signed by a high-ranking official whose name I prefer not to mention and was marked as ultra-confidential. The document stated, in ambiguous terms, that astronauts should avoid prolonged interaction with anomalous structures. Anomalous structures. There was no context, no explanations. The document was buried among piles of irrelevant records, as if someone had gone out of their way to hide it. At the time, I didn't think much of it. The Apollo program was already winding down, and my priority was ensuring that our work was transferred to future projects. But the thought kept gnawing at me. We were just beginning to explore the moon. Why would we pull back so quickly unless we had encountered something we weren't prepared to handle? Meanwhile, rumors circulated. Some people spoke of radio transmissions that were never released to the public. Others mentioned footage that had been erased, officials reassigned to other divisions without explanation, and even deliberate destruction of hardware that had been to the moon. The termination of the Apollo program felt like more than just a political decision. It felt like a containment strategy, as if we were dealing with something that couldn't be shared, not even among ourselves. The question that has haunted me ever since is, what did we find up there? And why does no one else seem to want to know the answer? During my career at NASA, there was always an unspoken understanding that not everything we knew could be shared. That was part of the job, of course. Advanced technologies, sensitive data, a lot had to be protected. But in the years following the end of the Apollo program, I began to realize that the line between protection and cover-up was thinner than I had imagined. I was reviewing telemetry data from Apollo 15 shortly after the mission returned to Earth. Our work was technical, analyzing information to understand failures, improve systems, and prepare for future missions. But behind the scenes, rumors were flying. There was talk of audio recordings that had been edited before being released to the public. Some of the radio transmissions, according to the rumors, contained fragments where the astronauts mentioned anomalies, unidentified sounds, interference, and even conversations that didn't appear in the official records. I usually dismissed rumors, But one day, while working on an internal archive system, I found something that made me question everything. It was a photograph, a high-resolution image captured by the Apollo 15 lunar module. It showed a typical lunar landscape, a sea of gray dust, shallow craters, and the curved horizon in the distance. But in the bottom left corner of the photo, something stood out. It was a structure. It looked metallic, slightly reflective, and partially buried in the surface. It wasn't something that could easily be mistaken for a natural formation. The geometry was angular, almost like the arms of an incomplete triangle, but with details that suggested something more complex. In that moment, I was stunned. I had seen thousands of lunar images over the years, but never anything like this. I called a colleague over to take a look, but by the time he arrived at my station, the image was gone. The file had disappeared from the system. Maybe it was reclassified, my colleague said casually. It was a standard response to any irregularity, but to me, it didn't make sense. I had just accessed it. Reclassifying something like that in a matter of minutes was, at the very least, unusual. I spent weeks trying to locate the file again. I combed through confidential directories, consulted lists of archived files, and even asked another engineer with higher security clearance for help. I found nothing. It was as if the photograph had never existed. Over time, other things began to catch my attention. There were gaps in the audio recordings from missions, segments abruptly cut or completely missing. Some video transmissions appeared to have been edited, with entire seconds skipped for no apparent technical reason. I vividly remember one night when a senior technician, visibly shaken, pulled me aside in a hallway at headquarters. He asked if I had ever noticed anything strange in the files. When I said yes, he just nodded, as if expecting that answer, and said, "If I were you, I'd forget about it. Some things are above our pay grade." At the time, I thought he was overreacting. But now, looking back, I realize he knew more than he was letting on. I haven't been able to forget the image of that metallic structure, nor the fragments of recordings that were never explained. Every piece of information seemed to point to the same conclusion. There was something on the moon we didn't want to admit. And the more I thought about it, the more one question consumed me. Did we end the Apollo program because we found everything we wanted? Or because we found something we never expected? Apollo 17 was the last manned mission to the moon. Officially, it was a triumph. Unprecedented geological records, new lunar rock samples, and the conclusion of a glorious era of space exploration. But behind the public celebrations, there was a dark subtext that few outside NASA ever knew. My proximity to the post-mission data analysis gave me access to fragments of information that never reached the public. Apollo 17 carried symbolic weight as the last opportunity to explore the lunar surface for decades. The astronauts were under pressure to maximize scientific results, but there was also an underlying tension, evident in the internal records. Among the files I revisited years later, I found some curious notes. A ground support technician had documented unusual communication interference during the mission. The recordings were cut, as if something had been edited or removed, but the fragments that remained were enough to pique my curiosity. One particular dialogue captured on the lunar surface caught my attention. Astronaut 1, "I'm seeing something on the far hill. It looks like it's moving." Astronaut 2, "It's probably just shadows from the rocks. Focus on the sample collection. We're on a tight schedule." Astronaut 1, "Shadows don't move against the light, and it's not our angle. This is something else." The conversation was abruptly cut off, but the technical logs indicated the transmission lasted longer than the available audio. Discrepancies like this were common in missions, but in this case, it seemed intentional. Another peculiar note came from the final extravehicular activity. One of the astronauts mentioned unusual structures while reporting on their exploration of a small valley. Despite their insistence on describing the finding, Mission Control responded evasively, almost impatiently. Mission Control understood. Continue the collection and return to the module on schedule. Astronaut, "You don't understand. This isn't natural." Those words, loaded with unease, stayed with me. Later, I discovered that the detailed mission report about this excursion had disappeared from the archives. The most intriguing discovery came days later when I received a set of uncatalogued images taken by one of the astronauts' cameras. One of them showed what appeared to be a metallic carcass partially buried in a crater. Its contours resembled a spacecraft, but it wasn't one of ours. It was smaller, more rudimentary, and its details suggested a design I could only describe as Soviet. At the time, it wasn't uncommon to come across space debris. The space race had left its mark both on Earth and in orbit, but on the Moon this was different. There was no official record of any Soviet manned or robotic mission reaching that location. The images, however, were never included in Apollo 17's public records. When I asked a supervisor about their whereabouts, he simply told me, "What you saw was a processing error. Nothing more." But I knew what I had seen. The crew's reports continued to intrigue me. In the final moments on the Moon, one of the astronauts made a cryptic comment during a live broadcast, something that went unnoticed by most. "There's much more here than we imagined. One day, I hope we can come back and understand it." Technicians monitoring the communications picked up what sounded like a tense discussion immediately after that statement, but the audio was cut off before any explanation. Later, in confidential records, I found a reference to figures sighted on the surface. There were no details, just one line in a technical report that seemed almost accidental. Visual monitoring. Moving shadows near eastern hills. These fragments left me with more questions than answers. There was no way to determine exactly what happened during Apollo 17, but it was clear the crew saw and experienced something that couldn't be fully explained or shared. And whatever it was, no one at NASA seemed willing to investigate further. There are events in history that are deliberately erased. Classified operations, secrets buried under layers of bureaucracy. Some of these stories surface years later, in fragments from declassified files or insider accounts. Others remain hidden forever, except to those close enough to feel their reverberations. The mission from 1989 falls into the latter category. I was nearing the end of my career at NASA when I first heard about it. I wasn't directly involved in the project, but rumors began circulating within restricted circles. It was a joint mission between the British and the Russians, an unusual collaboration for the time. Officially, the two nations were working together on scientific experiments related to space exploration. Unofficially, the mission had a far more sinister purpose: to investigate the site of an alleged lunar crash. The Soviets had maintained absolute silence about any failed attempts to reach the Moon during the space race. But internally, there seemed to be a consensus that something in a distant crater carried implications far beyond any geopolitical rivalry. The mission was hastily organized, under a secrecy bordering on paranoia. The equipment was rudimentary, and the teams were trained to handle a hostile environment, but no one knew exactly what they would face. Years later, I gained access to a preliminary report, and what I read left me stunned. The cosmonauts and British technicians had received direct orders to document any anomalies, but were instructed not to engage under any circumstances. The nature of the anomaly was never specified in the files I reviewed, but the landing site's coordinates matched exactly with what I believed to be the Soviet crash site spotted by Apollo 17. The mission's early transmissions were routine, technical reports, updates on sample collection, geological observations. But on the second day on the surface, the tone of the communications began to change. Cosmonaut 1, we found something near the crater's edge. It looks like debris. The material is different from ours. It's not from the module. Mission control, continue analysis. Document everything visually and do not approach without authorization. The tension in their voices was palpable, even in the incomplete records. Later, the transmission captured a series of static noises interspersed with fragmented phrases. Cosmonaut 2, there are markings on the ground. They don't look natural. Mission control, clarify. What kind of markings? Cosmonaut 2, they look like lines, symmetrical patterns, but there's no sign of erosion. It doesn't make sense. Shortly after, the transmissions began cutting out in strange ways. Ground technicians, both British and Russian, struggled to maintain contact. When the signal returned, what they heard was disturbing. Cosmonaut 1, something's moving. We're not alone. Mission control, repeat. Movement? Where? Cosmonaut 1, at the crater's edge. It's coming toward us. They're not human. Repeat, they're not. The audio abruptly cut off, followed by a long silence. When communication resumed, all that remained were indistinct sounds. Heavy breathing, hurried footsteps on lunar regolith, and a low, rhythmic noise that couldn't be identified. Mission control, team, respond. What's happening? Then came the final clear transmission. Cosmonaut 2, shadows. They're everywhere. The signals were lost soon after. There was no further contact with the team, nor any official attempt at a rescue. The mission was quickly declared a tragic accident, and the details were buried under a veil of secrecy. Later, I discovered that the fragments of recordings and mission logs had been completely erased from official systems. What remained were incomplete notes and the memories of those who heard the transmission live. For me, it confirmed something I had suspected since the end of the Apollo program. There was more to the moon than we were allowed to know. And whatever was there, it was something that even humanity's ingenuity couldn't explain or face. When I think about the 1989 mission, one question torments me. If we lost contact because they encountered something, what could be so terrifying that we've never tried to return? After the disappearance of the 1989 mission, NASA, at least officially, seemed to abandon any intention of returning to the moon. Instead, space agencies redirected their efforts to Earth orbits and planetary probes. But even with the withdrawal of humans, the moon continued watching us back, sending signals that few dared to interpret. It was in the late 1990s, during the height of space probe usage, that a series of incidents began to draw the attention of a handful of scientists, including myself. By then, I was assigned to a department focused on data analysis, working more on organizing information than on active collection. This, however, gave me access to records most people never saw. The Clementine probe, a joint mission between NASA and the US Department of Defense, was sent in 1994 to map the lunar surface with precision. Officially, it was a scientific effort to document the terrain in detail. Unofficially, some believed the probe had a military purpose, aiming to track something that had been detected decades earlier. The data it collected was extraordinary. Clementine captured images of craters on the far side of the moon showing phenomena difficult to explain. Among the hundreds of photographs analyzed, one sequence caught the attention of a few analysts before being abruptly reclassified. The images showed lights. They were small but clearly visible, pulsing in a regular pattern. They appeared to emerge from inside a deeply shadowed crater near the moon's south pole. The phenomenon was recorded for several minutes before disappearing. Preliminary explanations varied. Some suggested the lights might be sunlight reflecting off ice deposits, a plausible theory, but one that didn't account for the rhythmic pattern. Others argued it could be an instrumental error or interference. However, in the days that followed, data from other probes showed similar signals in different locations on the moon. Clementine was just the first. In 1998, the Lunar Prospector mission also captured similar anomalies. Radiation sensors detected strange variations while flying over specific craters on the far side, particularly in the South Pole-Aitken Basin, one of the moon's most mysterious regions. The pattern was always the same: brief, pulsing lights that seemed to follow a defined rhythm before disappearing again. At the time, some researchers began proposing more daring theories. The idea that these lights might be caused by underground geothermal activity was discussed but quickly dismissed, since the moon, as far as we know, lacks the internal heat necessary to sustain such phenomena. Another, more unsettling hypothesis gained traction in unofficial circles. The lights might be artificial signals. Some believed they were attempts at communication, while others thought they could indicate some form of operational activity in an unknown subterranean network. The records of these missions, however, were gradually overshadowed by other scientific and political interests. Despite mounting evidence of something unusual on the moon, NASA and other space agencies never formally investigated. Those who dared to question the origin of the lights were ignored or diverted to other projects. A colleague who mentioned the lights during a technical meeting was quickly silenced. I remember a supervisor saying, "We explored the moon for years. We found nothing. Those lights are not our concern." But indifference didn't erase the data. The lights continued to appear, always in specific regions, always brief, and always without explanation. Why didn't we investigate? Why did we distance ourselves from something so clearly unusual? The only answer I can conceive is that those in positions of authority already knew enough. Perhaps they understood that any further investigation could reveal something we weren't ready to confront or accept. To me, the lights in the craters are more than inexplicable phenomena. They're reminders that the moon holds secrets beyond our comprehension. More importantly, they're signs that even as we turn our attention to Mars or beyond, something on the moon remains active, watching and waiting. Not everything we've discovered in space comes from advanced sensors or automated probes. Some stories come from direct testimonies, accounts of people who were there when fragments of something greater were revealed. One such account came from Carl Wolf, someone I worked with briefly in the late 1980s, though our paths had crossed long before. Wolf was a U.S. Air Force technician involved in processing space imagery during the early Apollo missions. He had access to areas I wouldn't hear about until years later. Our conversation took place in a quiet cafe, far from NASA's halls or military installations. It was 1988, and Wolf seemed like a man carrying a burden he couldn't openly share. "Have you ever heard about the images of the moon's far side?" he asked bluntly. I nodded, recalling the fragmented records from Clementine and Lunar Prospector. "Some things, yes. Nothing concrete." "Why?" He studied me for a moment, as if deciding how much he could trust me. Then he began speaking, low enough that no one around us could hear. "In 1965, I was called to a base where they were processing images from Lunar Orbiter. They were detailed maps, captured to prepare for the Apollo missions. Nothing unusual, except for a few photos that had been sent for separate analysis." He paused, stirring his coffee. "I was tasked with repairing equipment in a room where these images were being analyzed. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I heard enough to understand what it was. And I saw photos of the moon's far side. Structures. The word hung in the air. Structures. What kind of structures?" I asked, trying not to sound too skeptical. "Things that shouldn't be there," he said. "Tall towers, translucent domes. Some looked like they were made of crystal or something similar, while others had strange shapes, almost organic, like giant mushrooms. They were spread across an entire region, and it was impossible to mistake them for natural formations." He explained that the technicians present were debating how to interpret the images. Some argued they might be processing artifacts or camera malfunctions, but most agreed they were real. Wolf believed the photographs would be made public after proper analysis, but to his surprise, they never were. "After that day, I never heard about those images again," he continued, "and I trusted my intuition to not mention it to anyone for years. But now, seeing how things have played out, I think it was covered up from the start. I thought of the Apollo mission anomalies, the pulsing lights in the craters, and the 1989 mission. Each fragment seemed to fit into a larger puzzle, but the pieces Wolf described were the most intriguing. A city of alien origin, hidden on the moon's far side, where sunlight never directly reaches. "Do you think NASA knew?" I asked. He gave a bitter laugh. "NASA? They were just one of the players involved. This is much bigger. From the beginning, there seemed to be a chain of command above the agency. Like the most important decisions were being made elsewhere. Years later, As I revisited transcripts and analyzed images I'd accessed from restricted archives, I kept returning to that conversation. Was there evidence? Not directly, but the blurred and reclassified images, the gaps in Apollo mission records, and the unexplained events all pointed to something larger being deliberately hidden. If Wolf was telling the truth, and I believe he was, then the history of lunar exploration is a facade. And the question that still haunts me is, if there was a city on the dark side of the moon, why did we never return to study it? Or did we return, but no one was authorized to know? Few moments in the history of space exploration carry the same enigmatic weight as the sounds recorded during Apollo 10. Officially, the mission was a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11's lunar landing, a test that took the crew into lunar orbit to perform critical maneuvers before the historic step. But for those familiar with the details, Apollo 10 is remembered for something far more inexplicable. The so-called space music. Mission records indicate that the sounds began as soon as the lunar module separated from the command module and entered the far side of the moon. With Earth blocked, the crew was completely isolated, unable to communicate with mission control. It was supposed to be absolute silence. For almost an hour, as the module orbited the moon, the astronauts reported a strange sound echoing through their headsets. The audio, recovered years later, revealed their reactions to the phenomenon. Astronaut 1, are you hearing that? What the hell is that? Astronaut 2, yeah, sounds like music, but it doesn't make sense. We're on the moon. There shouldn't be anything. The sound was high-pitched, almost melodic, but also irregular, as though it followed a pattern that wasn't entirely human. The astronauts described it as electronic whistling, and at times their voices trembled with a mix of fascination and discomfort. When they returned within communication range of Earth, they did not mention the sounds to mission control, at least not in public records. There seemed to be a silent agreement among the crew that what they heard shouldn't be discussed, at least not openly. I only learned about this audio decades later, when I gained access to confidential files while reviewing Apollo mission records. The recordings weren't included in official reports, but were stored under a code labeled auditory anomaly. Subsequent analyses attempted to provide technical explanations. Some suggested the sounds might have been radio interference caused by the proximity of the lunar and command modules. Others speculated that it could have been static noise resulting from the interaction between the moon's magnetic field and the spacecraft's instruments. But none of these theories explained why the sounds had a distinct, almost intentional pattern, or why they were only heard on the far side of the moon. The possibility of a non-natural origin was raised in private circles. Among the few technicians and scientists who had access to the recordings, some believed the sound might be a form of transmission, an unknown signal originating from beneath the lunar surface. This theory gained traction years later when other space missions, including automated probes, reported similar anomalies. Some probes detected brief radio pulses and frequencies outside the expected spectrum while orbiting the moon. The data was archived and forgotten, as though no one wanted to deal with the implications. I listened to the Apollo 10 audio more than once. It's unsettling not for what it reveals, but for what it suggests. There's something alien in that space music, something that transcends our technological and scientific understanding. Could the sounds have been messages, or were they merely remnants of something ancient, something the moon has preserved as a capsule of lost echoes through time? What's most disturbing is that, even after decades, no deeper investigation was ever conducted. Perhaps it's because the idea that we're not alone, and that someone or something might be communicating in ways we don't understand, is a mystery even the boldest scientists aren't ready to face. And perhaps it's better that way. Apollo 11 is remembered as the fulfillment of a dream, the moment humanity took its small step onto the lunar surface. But beyond the public glory, there's a layer of accounts and events that never reached the public's knowledge. Over the years, fragments of these stories have surfaced in conversations among technicians and astronauts, only to be quickly silenced or discredited. What I saw and heard during my career reinforces the idea that the inaugural moon landing unearthed something NASA never wanted to reveal. It all began with the radio transmissions recorded during the lunar module's descent. Although most of the audio was transmitted live to mission control and the world, there are segments that were isolated and preserved only in confidential archives. One of the most intriguing excerpts involves a conversation between Armstrong and Aldrin as they made their final preparations to land. A technician I worked with in the 1980s claimed to have heard the original audio before it was classified. According to him, Armstrong mentioned observing something near the crater where they would land. Armstrong, there seems to be something here, a metallic shine on the crater's edge. Aldrin, it's hard to make out. Is it reflecting sunlight? Armstrong, negative. It doesn't look natural. This dialogue never appeared in public records. What was released was carefully edited, with any mention of unusual objects removed. After the landing, Armstrong and Aldrin conducted their first lunar walk under the watchful eyes of the world. But there's another moment, less known, that was only discussed years later in restricted circles. A private conversation between the two, captured by an internal microphone while they were inside the lunar module. According to confidential records, Armstrong described seeing cylindrical objects as the module approached the surface. He mentioned that they appeared to hover and followed the descent, maintaining a constant distance. Aldrin, initially skeptical, saw them too. Aldrin, it's like they're watching us. What do you think they are? Armstrong, I don't know, but it's not us. The discussion was brief but marked by a tone of unease. Similar reports emerged during other Apollo missions, but Apollo 11 was the first to clearly document these objects. Then there were the photographs. During their walk, Armstrong and Aldrin took hundreds of pictures, many of which were transmitted back to Earth in real time. However, some images never reached the public. An imaging engineer I worked with confided that some of these photographs showed metallic structures near craters, far from the landing site. According to him, the shapes were geometric, with defined angles that seemed impossible to occur naturally. They were constructions, he said. There was no other explanation. Towers, cylinders, and even what looked like a ruined bridge. I asked what happened to these images, and his response was blunt. They were archived or destroyed. All I know is I never saw them again. Over the years, I searched for any clues in the archives I had access to, but all I found were vague references in technical reports. Some missions mentioned interference caused by unidentified objects, but these were always described ambiguously. What unsettles me is the silent consensus among those who were there. Everyone seemed to know there was something on the moon that wasn't meant to be revealed. Armstrong, in particular, rarely spoke about what he saw, but in a rare interview, he mentioned that there were great surprises waiting for those brave enough to explore. What did he mean? And why were these great surprises never officially explored? I often think about the metallic structures. If they really existed, who built them? And how long have they been there? Perhaps Apollo 11 revealed more than humanity's ability to reach the stars. Perhaps it showed us that we weren't the first to walk on that surface. During my career, I heard many theories about the moon, some more plausible than others. But none have been as persistent or as unsettling as the so-called hollow moon theory. It was an idea whispered only in murmurs among scientists, a hypothesis that, absurd as it might seem, found strange support in concrete data. It all began with Apollo 12, the second manned mission to land on the moon. Among its objectives was testing the seismometers left by Apollo 11, instruments designed to record vibrations on the lunar surface and provide data about its internal composition. To achieve this, NASA planned a simple yet unexpected experiment, intentionally crashing the lunar module's upper stage into the moon's surface. When the impact occurred, no one was prepared for the results. The seismometer detected something that defied logic. The moon reverberated. For over an hour, seismic waves echoed as if the surface was a rigid shell surrounding a hollow structure. One of the mission's scientists described the event memorably. The moon rang like a bell. The data was analyzed extensively, but the official explanation remained vague. Some proposed that the reverberation could be explained by differences in the moon's internal density, perhaps due to large cavities or even the lack of a dense metallic core like Earth's. However, the recorded patterns were so unique that no simulation could replicate them. Years later, during Apollo 13, another seismic experiment was conducted accidentally when the Saturn V rocket's SIVB stage collided with the lunar surface. Once again, the moon reverberated, this time for more than 3 hours. This reinforced the idea that its internal composition was vastly different from what we had assumed. This anomaly gave rise to a series of speculations. The boldest of these was the theory that the moon wasn't a natural celestial body but rather an artificial structure, an external shell covering something much larger, perhaps even an alien station. At first, I dismissed this idea as pure fantasy. It was easier to believe in natural cavities or unusual geological processes. But over time, other evidence began to emerge. The moon's average density is significantly lower than Earth's, suggesting it is surprisingly light for its size. Additionally, analysis of materials collected during the Apollo missions revealed that some lunar rocks contained isotopes that didn't match anything found on Earth or in known meteorites. This raised questions about the moon's true origin. Some theorists proposed that the moon was placed in Earth's orbit by an advanced civilization, possibly to monitor or even influence our planet. The idea seemed absurd until I started connecting the dots with the data I'd collected over the years. The metallic structures reported during Apollo 11, the pulsating lights and craters, and even the sounds captured by Apollo 10, all seemed to point to a greater truth. The hollow moon theory, as bold as it was, offered a unifying explanation. The moon wasn't just a natural satellite. It was something constructed. NASA never officially commented on these theories, and the seismic anomalies were dismissed as scientific curiosities without further investigation. But for me, the silence spoke louder than any official statement. If the moon truly is hollow or contains something within that we don't understand, what does that mean for our history? Are we mere observers of a larger mystery, or are we part of an experiment far beyond our comprehension? Of all the questions I carry, this is the one that haunts me most. What if the moon isn't just observing us, but also influencing us? During the Apollo missions, every word spoken by the astronauts was carefully monitored and recorded. This included public and private transmissions, captured by a robust communication system. Officially, the mission records were preserved for posterity, a detailed archive of humanity's greatest achievement. But what was never revealed to the public is that not all transmissions made it into the final archives. In technical circles, we called this lost audio, small segments of communication that didn't appear in official transcripts. Sometimes these were attributed to technical failures or interference, but those of us behind the scenes knew that some of these failures were deliberate. I first heard about these anomalies shortly after Apollo 11. Experienced technicians mentioned transmissions that didn't make sense, descriptions of things the astronauts saw that were quickly suppressed. As my career progressed, I had the opportunity to access undisclosed segments of the missions, fragments of dialogue revealing a different side of the lunar journeys. One of the most intriguing accounts came from Apollo 12. During a reconnaissance orbit, the astronauts reported seeing a metallic object stationary in a crater below the module. The official transcript mentioned only an interesting geological formation, but in an uncatalogued audio recording, the actual dialogue was far more detailed. Astronaut 1, it looks like a structure. The reflection is really strong. Astronaut 2, are you saying it's made of metal? Astronaut 1, yes, that's what it looks like. It's definitely not a rock. Technicians who heard the transmission live confirmed that the object was observed for several minutes before the module left the area. However, no data about this crater was included in the scientific reports. Another fascinating case occurred during Apollo 15. While exploring a region near Hadley Rill, the astronauts mentioned what they described as an opening in the ground, What seemed to be a simple cave was quickly dismissed when instruments detected a faint but consistent magnetic field emanating from the opening. Astronaut 1, there's something strange here. We're picking up magnetic readings. Do you think it could be equipment, mission control, continue with sample collection? That's not part of the mission scope, Astronaut 1, but it's an anomaly. Someone needs to investigate. That last statement was cut from the public transcript but was clearly audible in the original file. Subsequent analyses were archived, and no mention of the opening appeared in later reports. Over time, some of these audio fragments and transcripts began to leak to the public. These were usually released by former NASA employees or technicians who had kept unauthorized copies of the files. Some of the most notorious leaks included detailed descriptions of cylindrical objects that accompanied Apollo 11 and structures on the lunar surface captured by cameras but never disclosed. NASA was quick to label these leaks as fabrications. Official statements claimed the recordings were the work of conspiracists or had been manipulated to create sensationalism. In some cases, independent experts confirmed the audio's authenticity, but public opinion had already been swayed by NASA's denials. What intrigues me is the consistency between the leaked reports and what I saw in confidential files. The astronauts' descriptions of metallic structures, underground anomalies, and even pulsating lights perfectly matched the anomalies recorded during missions like Clementine and Lunar Prospector. The reason for suppressing these transmissions is a question that still haunts me. Was NASA afraid to admit there was something on the moon that we didn't understand, or worse, something we couldn't control? Or was the truth so profound, so disruptive, that revealing it would threaten public order? The lost audio from the Apollo missions is more than a curiosity. It's a clue, a fragment of a larger story that has been carefully dismantled and buried. While humanity celebrates the legacy of the Apollo missions, those who listen to the original transmissions know there's another narrative, stranger, more unsettling, hidden between the lines of the official transcripts. Few people in modern history bore a greater burden than Neil Armstrong. He was the first human to walk on another celestial body, an icon of space exploration and the human spirit. But away from the cameras and the public, there was a side of Armstrong few ever knew, a side marked by doubts, unease, and a fear he could never fully explain. I first heard about this side of Armstrong in a conversation with a former astronaut, someone who had also been part of the Apollo program. He was a reserved man, rarely speaking of his experiences outside of restricted circles. We met at a conference years after both of us had left NASA, and that night he decided to share something he had kept to himself for a long time. "Did you know Armstrong believed we were being warned?" he asked bluntly. "Warned? What do you mean?" He paused, as if carefully choosing his words. He never said it publicly, but after Apollo 11, he told a few close people that we weren't welcome on the moon. He thought someone, or something, was telling us not to come back. The former astronaut told me that this idea didn't stem from a single event, but from several small occurrences during the Apollo 11 mission. Armstrong was a man of science, methodical, not prone to jumping to conclusions. But what he saw and felt on the moon left a deep mark on him. During the lunar module's descent, Armstrong and Aldrin reported a series of pulsating lights on the horizon. Initially, it was thought they were reflections or optical artifacts, but the lights seemed to change position, as if they were observing the module. There were also the famous cylindrical objects that accompanied Apollo 11. While officially dismissed as space debris or meteors, Armstrong confided to colleagues that they seemed to maneuver deliberately, as if monitoring the mission. Another event the former astronaut mentioned was the sighting of metallic structures near the crater where they landed. These structures were never publicly discussed, but Armstrong described them as unnatural. He believed they were remnants of something ancient, constructed by unknown intelligences. After returning to Earth, Armstrong attended a private meeting with top NASA executives and external consultants. At that meeting, he expressed his concerns, suggesting that the evidence found on the moon indicated forces beyond human understanding were involved. "He used the word warning," said the former astronaut. "He said we weren't welcome, that we had crossed some boundary." Shortly afterward, NASA began redirecting its efforts. The focus shifted from manned missions to automated probes and orbital research. Promises of lunar bases and regular missions were quickly abandoned, citing budget cuts and lack of public interest. But for those behind the scenes, the change seemed deliberate. It was as if the agency had decided that the cost of returning to the moon, not financially but in terms of risk, was too high. "Do you think Armstrong was right?" I asked the former astronaut. He nodded, his gaze distant. Neil was a skeptic, a man who didn't believe in anything without evidence. If he was concerned, there was a reason. He wasn't scared by something he saw. He was scared because he felt like someone was watching us, like we had trespassed on their territory. Armstrong rarely spoke in detail about Apollo 11 after his return. He was known for his discretion, preferring to keep the focus on the team and the program as a whole. But in an interview years later, he made an enigmatic statement that many interpreted as a reference to his concerns. "There are great wonders out there, waiting to be discovered, but there are also dangers, and it's up to humanity to decide whether it wants to face them." NASA continued exploring the moon with probes, but the era of manned missions ended with Apollo 17. Since then, the silence surrounding the moon has become as deafening as the lost transmissions and reclassified files. Armstrong's fear was never officially documented, but it reflected in how NASA began to act. Perhaps that's why, to this day, no one has returned to the lunar surface. And perhaps that's exactly what whoever's there wants. Over the years, as I pieced together the fragments of everything I saw and heard during my career, a disturbing image began to emerge. It wasn't just the moon itself that seemed to harbor secrets. There was something much larger, something that transcended our understanding of space exploration. The remains of Soviet spacecraft, the attacks on joint missions, the pulsating lights and craters, the metallic structures, each piece, no matter how disconnected it seemed, pointed to the same truth. The moon isn't just Earth's natural satellite. It's an outpost, an observatory, a boundary line. During a late-stage analysis of Apollo mission data, I encountered an anomaly that was never publicly explained. Among the records of radio transmissions captured on the moon's far side, there were frequencies that seemed to match low-intensity artificial signals detected on Earth. These frequencies were almost identical to those we use for terrestrial communication, but slightly shifted, as if they were being mimicked. At the time, I thought it was a coincidence, perhaps a reading error or interference. But years later, reports of inexplicable signals intercepted by military listening stations in the 1970s reinforced my suspicions. These weren't just signals coming from the moon. They were signals that seemed to echo between the moon and Earth. Someone or something was communicating between these two worlds. The idea seemed absurd until I heard from an external consultant who worked with data from NASA and Department of Defense secret missions. During a casual conversation at a symposium, he confided that in the 1980s, there was a series of investigations into the possibility of external interference in space programs. He didn't go into detail, but suggested that some of the structures detected on the moon had characteristics that seemed both organic and mechanical. "What if it's not just there?" he asked with a serious look. I knew exactly what he was implying, and the thought never left me. The theory that the same beings responsible for the structures on the moon might have a presence on Earth is one of the most unsettling I've ever heard, but indirect evidence makes it impossible to dismiss. Engineers have reported mysterious alterations in electronic systems during missions, inexplicable changes in satellite coordinates, and even UFO sightings that seem to violate known laws of physics. If the moon is an outpost, then perhaps Earth is the study field. Neil Armstrong believed we were warned. I believe he was right. Every manned mission was marked by events that defied logic and science. But rather than face them head-on, we chose to retreat. NASA abandoned manned missions after Apollo 17. Plans for permanent bases were shelved, And even today, with advanced technologies, we avoid exploring the moon in the same way we did over 50 years ago. Was it a conscious choice? Or was it a decision made under the influence of something greater? Since retiring, I've shared fragments of this story in restricted circles. I never thought I'd live to document it all so openly, but time is running out. In recent weeks, I've started noticing strange things. Unanswered phone calls, cars parked for too long outside my house, glitches in my electronic devices. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's not. I know that by sharing this, I'm putting my life at risk. But as I grow older, I realize the world needs to know the truth. Not to incite panic, but to be prepared. The moon holds secrets that defy our understanding. Lights, structures, signals, and perhaps something far closer than we'd like to admit. They don't want us to know. Perhaps it's better that way. But if one day we decide to return, let it be with our eyes wide open. Because in the end, the question isn't whether we're ready to know the truth. The question is, what if they're ready for us?